was trying to see if I could, while you were talking about different works, connect if it was legitimate to make some connections. And I would like to risk something and see what your response would be. But one of the things that you have mentioned, I think, quite insistently is this sort of refusal of the visual in Bruce's work, and this sort of strong emphasis in what is called the haptic, right? It's interesting. I was just telling Caroline, I was reading this book by Éric Michaud. It's called The Barbarian Invasions, and it's basically a sort of a narrative by which he shows how racialized our history has been since its beginnings. And one of the key points was this differentiation between the visual, this hierarchy, the establishment of this hierarchy in which the visual and cultures that are supposed to be visual are placed on top of cultures that are supposed to be haptic. And that is connected with, of course, painting being prioritized, acquiring a highest place in the hierarchy than sculpture, right? And we do live in a world in which images are absolutely hegemonic in so many ways. Images are the way by which, as Achille Mbembe says, images are the way in which we create value by selling images, right? And in Bruce's work, and he is a visual artist, but as you say, there is this insistence in the haptic, right? This neutralization of the visual through the haptic, which has a lot to do with being a sculptor, maybe, and he still refers to himself as a sculptor. So that's one thread, but it's connected to something else that you somewhat insisted upon, which is the notion of constraint. That his main device is to constrain you through, physically or psychologically, or using language, let's say, using language as a constraint, so that your body starts feeling, so that you feel, you start unfeeling your body and feeling it itself as that sort of psychophysical membrane that you pointed out, which it would be really interesting to think through that. What is that psychophysical membrane in which there is no interiority in the sense of subjectivization, the subjectivization that comes with the image? I'm thinking about, of course, the mirror stage and how, the visual conduces to subjectivization. And I believe that sort of membrane, psychophysical membrane, is a psychophysical membrane in which there's no stable image to refer to. There's no interiority that can be referred to a stable image, right?
No, and no exteriority in a way. For me, it has been always very complicated to understand what mental space is about, what is inside, what is outside. And I think this destroys the idea that they're both are symbolic of one another, representative of one another. He puts them together. He sometimes dismiss the whole idea, to try, as you say, to understand the skin-like quality, I would say, the skin without skin, it's walls more than skins, but the idea of a membrane. And to add to what you were saying, there is a very, very, very obvious difference between, seeing and hearing in terms of membranes, or smelling in terms of membrane, is that, with the eyes, you can close your eyes. You can actually control something. With the ears, as a very famous comic strip in France called Spirou said it very well, ears have no eyelids.
There's also something that you both mentioned in a way, which I think for me is an incredible experiment, is that it doesn't allow you to be quiet. You are in a disturbing space, which push you to make a decision of existence, because he opens those in-between things that we close because it's frightening in a day life, which is the only way to deal with the fear, to allow a kind of authorization to put yourself even in a place. And one of the most difficult things is to start to speak, also to make sound. It's something extremely difficult still. And you can make fake sound or real sound as power discussion using the thing which I already said everywhere. And that's also why I'm fascinated in his work with the words, because the words don't speak, they shout, and they shout in contrast position.
As you both said, I think the mirror stage is out. There is no mirror. There's nothing like that. So it resonates instead of reflecting. So it's not a reflection that is needed. It's a rhythm. It's a resonance. It's a flux. It's something that has to do with the idea of the membrane again. The idea that the membrane doesn't reflect anything. It does. It resonates. It captivates. It also responds. I'm always fascinated, by loudspeakers. The way when the music.
There's that famous one by Gary Hill, just about the movement of the membrane of the speaker.
But let's figure Bruce Nauman like that, like this, his work like that. But although it's very difficult, I agree with all you've said, but what I find very difficult also with Nauman is to concentrate on one idea, one thing. It's very complicated.
I was reading all the written instruction of the performance in the early 60s. Oh, it's incredible, all the place he goes. Incredible with the body. And I was reading that he read comportementalist kind of psychological books. He doesn't give so much references in general, but that he read that.
Gregory Bateson, I think he read Gregory Bateson, and all the Palo Alto school, I think.
And the double language I learned through the Palo Alto school too. The double mind.
Yes, it is. They actually.
It's from there when I studied at the time psychoanalysis.
It is definitely. Certainly the work is impossible to summarize in one thought. But it is true, Élisabeth, that what you point out, that itinerary that you point out, it's very strong and consistent. And it is. To me, it surprises me that our references to understand it are very different than what seem to have been his theoretical or artistic references to develop it. It's actually amazing to me. We know he read Beckett, he read Wittgenstein. His novel story, like detective stories constantly and obsessively. It's a very kind. He thinks about Cage and Jones. It's really interesting that the referential universe seems to be quite distant from ours.
The world can live different lives. I think that's the interesting part.
Yes, also we cannot not see from the point of view of today, where it's so pertinent, within this pandemic we're living in, it's also really interesting to think about spaces, trying to de-symbolize things as he's done. And I read that he was trained as a mathematician, so he's used those two symbols. So it's really also a kind of really interesting idea that, as you said, he's trained as a visual artist and he disavows visuality to the haptic, and then to a space of sensoriality, at least. That's why I think my father was so enthralled with it. It's because this space of sensoriality is something that has to do. It was my big reconciliation with my parents, I have to say. I would have to say, as a kind of conclusion of that. But a space of sensoriality, which is not at all non-verbal. It's not the problem. It really makes me think about the what Kristeva calls the cora semiotique, the semiotics instead of the symbolics.
Yes. Huh? The embodied signs all over.
Yes.
And what you said, you started by saying that the thought of Bruce haunted you, and the hauntedness, it's also a very interesting quality, because I find that he's most effective, and that speaks to the show. I think that many of the things that you've said speak to the show, right? I'm constantly thinking, okay, so, are we translating properly, which I think we are, but what he's doing at the level of the individual works, at the level of the exhibition, is the exhibition itself haunted? And the hauntedness consists, I think, in forcing you to think about it when you're not present, which is a very strange temporal relationship with the word.
I could not more agree with you. I link that to the fact that he's also been obsessed with representing backs. And for me, it has something to do with that. I mean, representing, I'm not so sure, but the corridor in which you see yourself from the back, the back of Henry Moore. I mean, all these works where, so indeed, he is sort of embodying the fact that the works are going to pursue you.
But also in his work, there's some things which come back all the time, like he's himself obsessed. Speaking, going back to, it's like a permanent ritournelle who cannot stop repeating.
And I'm curious about that, the sexuality. I mean, I don't know if you call it desire, sexuality in the work, because it is not unproblematic for sure. Everybody who sees those images from the 60s, he is an object of desire, I think unwillingly perhaps, but he's so beautiful as a man, right?
Oh, yeah.
And he never explicitly addressed the question of sexuality. I mean, there's art makeup. I mean, it's so strange also the way in which sexuality and gender relations appear in the work.
The makeup and the bouncing balls, and then the
bouncing balls, but then later, like the violin incident, male and female, but just killing each other. And in the most recent ones, I mean, the body is decaying. It's an aging body. It doesn't seem sexualized at all. It's just if one thinks about how does that appear in the work, it's very troubling, I think,
It's very troubling. I know that many queer writers have written about the fact that, masculinity, white masculinity is somewhat of a failure, is somewhat unlivable in Nauman's work, and that there is always this problem of that it fails, that it's a double bind, that you are constrained to a certain type of masculinity, but this masculinity is just unbearable. And I totally agree, because he appears as very beautiful, but also as a kind of macho guy, and when you see his photographs, with the cowboy hat, and even now, but there's always this very strange relationship to the way his body can actually appear. And it's true that Walk with Contrapposto, I mean, it's exactly the contrary. It's really a gay, I guess, really a faggot, as Warhol could be said was a faggot. I mean, it's really more interesting to think about his work as a reflection on that failure of masculinity and that unlivability of the proclaimed dominant gender and posture in the world, and even in the art world. Don't you think so?
And I think that's interesting. I mean, I think that I know him, personally, and I know of his relationship with horses and horse riding, and, how important that is for him. And you never get the feeling of a macho guy with Bruce at all. I think he was an incredibly caring partner, and it's a very sensitive person in a way. I mean, I think that the feeling that you have when you're with him is this incredibly warm and affective person, and so it is strange to have to reconcile that with the image, the cow, and I wonder how that appears in the work. And I don't know. I don't have an answer for that,
There's one word that the discussion that he made, which is him as a cowboy, in a way, making the corner. And he's just someone who doesn't know. I mean, he shows the slowness and how he makes it, and it's something that obviously he didn't knew. It's the opposite of that white hero kind of identity we're used to.
Well, that was interesting. I read recently in an interview at Tate, I think he talks about that piece. Carolina says, I was trying to learn to do it. And he said, he showed it to somebody who makes corners, and he said, well, I would make it in a different way.
Because it takes a long time to make the corner.
Yeah.
And the corner is also the space coming back, close, open, all the questions.
What could think also, that he cannot embody that identity, the white male macho identity. He cannot embody his own body. I mean, like, I think it's
I agree.
It's like this sort of, it's maybe consonant with that. Yeah.
Yes. And, what has really stricken me also, going back to the images and the works, is seeing that he is not able to sculpt a body. He always sculpts the body with the space around. And I think that's typically unmacho. The dominant sculptor sculpts body, and the space is dominated by the body. And he is always talking about what's constraining the body, what is the space around the body, how can you make concrete, physical things that are outside the body. So suddenly the potency of the body disappears totally, in all these spaces around. And I think that's fantastic. I think that's really an anti-dominant gesture also. This kind of kindness that you're talking about. To be deferent to the space that's surrounding you.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to reconcile that kindness with the violence. And in the work, there is a lot of violence, but vulnerability, I mean, it's a violence that also always comes from a place of vulnerability, It's maybe, if one can say that. I don't know. There's so much to think.
Yes. Yes. Yes, I feel that vulnerability. And that's, again, the effect that this violence has also on the visitor, on the spectator, on the person who doesn't know, because it makes some kind of an effect on you. You become vulnerable, so you translate that vulnerability into your own body. Don't you think so?
Me, for sure. And I'm very much forward. In the show, there's a lot of disturbance. I mean, so you cannot. None of us could control. We're going to be disturbed all the time. So and because a lot of work speaks about that, or makes you feel, because of the sound, because of the corridors.
And what do you think as curators? Because curating is also a way to, deal with the stability of the work. You have to install it, which is to find a place for it, to make it stable. So how can you actually feel this tension, this vulnerability?
Long question. It started for that show to really have the basics, so to speak, in terms of ancestral, in terms of since the beginning of the voices, I would say, of Nauman, which is with the space and the limit of the space, as you said. With the sound, everything is very, very, very much with the link with the sound and with the physical experiments. And for me, this is the language of Nauman, more than the objects.
But I think it's also the kind of, we had a conversation with Philippe, Parren, in which we asked him, so when you are talking about Nauman, or your first impressions of Nauman, are you talking about Nauman or Nauman through other artists as well? How do you receive the work? And he said, no, it was always a choral for me, the reception. When I'm thinking of Nauman, I'm also thinking about Mears, Cunningham, and Cage. And I have to say that there is an effort to connect with the logic of the work and to translate the logic of the work in the logic of an exhibition. But if I have to, interrogate myself to that point, I would say the translation of what I perceive to be the logic of the work into the logic of the exhibition is choral. By choral, I mean that there's many voices there. Certainly, working together with Caroline, but also Philippe, itself, and the way in which he thinks about an exhibition as a work and a work as an exhibition, and the whole thinking about what is it that an exhibition can do. So there's a lot of that in between the apprehension of the work and what we believe the viewer will apprehend.
And so you have also to think about the viewer as choral.
Of course.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Of course.
We think about us as viewers and the viewers, as complete. Yeah, I mean, I think that you have to put yourself in the skin. To talk about skin,
yeah,
you have to put yourself in the skin of the viewer.
And it starts with a sound peak from outside. It's immediately with no images and with a physical touch approach, something that you cannot not hear again.
I think that you walk through a space, which is outside the space, and there's a sound that you recover inside the space, and there's a questioning of what is it that I heard, and a recognition. And then I would say there is a wind of darkness. I think that what the show is a sort of stream of darkness, a stream of darkness that will take you from outside the show until the end. You will be, I believe, somewhat navigating a stream of darkness. And I think that's what's defined the experience of it. I think that we are all navigating a stream of darkness right now.
And there's so many people who spoke about Nauman because of the confinement, specifically the first one.
I would say because of the corridor, because of those spaces. It's waiting rooms, it's waiting chambers, but there's no issue. There's no beginning and no end of that. And that's what is so incredible in his work, is that there are liminal spaces, there are transitory spaces that become what we're living in right now.
Yeah, I mean, you are making me think of both of you of America, of Kafka's America, of course, And I think that there is, I don't know if Kafkan is a word that could be used to describe Bruce's, but I think that the show will have a Kafkan quality.
They were a show with Beckett and Nauman curated, and I see that weird space in Beckett's books as one of there's something of that weird space. I don't know how to define slowness, something where you can lose and reconquer what's your own limits in a way.
Beckett also speaks incredibly about the inside and the outside and the membrane.
All the time.
Yes. No, it's really, it's really very and really crucial questions at the moment, that we are living inside.